Yep. Scott's going to talk to us, or give us a presentation today, help on doing an impact evaluation. What evidence do I need? Before I hand over to Scott, I'm just still admitting people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on. And today we're meeting on a variety of lands, not just the local South Australian Kaurna lands, but I'm there, so I'm going to acknowledge the owners of those lands. And I'd like to recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and cultures, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And also, I recognise that many of you are on different lands, and I recognise those as well. I'd like to acknowledge them. Just move the slides. Before I hand over to Scott, I'd just like to alert you to an event that's happening on the 5th of July, so coming up soon. South Australia is collaborating with the Melbourne AES on a number of events, and this is one that's coming up. They're going to be having a panel discussion on recent evaluation publications and research, and that's looking at what's happened in the last little while, 2015 to 19. So what are the implications of the findings? It was a systemic review raised for evaluation, research and practice. What has research told us about the importance of values and valuing in relation to evaluation theories, methods and practices? And how has the research influenced or informed your own practice? So a bit of a chance for a discussion as well. So if you're interested, and I encourage you to be interested, please visit the AES website and register. The link is on the website. So it's a long link, so I didn't paste it in here. Okay, just get that person. And now to talk about Scott a little before he begins his talk today. Scott, you'll notice, has a slightly different accent. He's originally from Canada, but has been in Australia for many years. He's based in Canberra now, although he's been in other parts of Australia as well. He's had over 30 years of experience in evaluation and has worked in quite a number of prominent areas. He's worked in the Oxford policy management area, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Asian Development Bank, the Victorian Department of Human Services. So he's been around, done a lot of work. He's also a fellow of the Society, and he's published widely on evaluation. I'd like you to welcome Scott, and I'll hand over to him now. We're just going to swap the screen, so bear with us while we do that. We'll have a chance for discussion at the end of Scott's talk as well. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Mark, and hello, everyone. I'll just get up my presentation screen. All right, can you see that okay, Mark?
Not yet. No.
Oh, it's up on my screen.
Have you hit the share button?
Ah. Where the heck do I find that?
So on the Zoom screen, the share button is on my menu in the sort of in the middle at the bottom.
Ah, share screen.
Share screen.
All right.
Excellent. Now I can see it.
We cooking with gas now?
We're going. Excellent.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you, everyone. My presentation is really targeted at those of you who hire consultants to do impact evaluations, undertake impact evaluations using your own staff, people who review evaluation reports and you're wondering if they're credible, defensible, and those of you who are interested in the strengths and weaknesses of different impact evaluation methods. Over about the next 45 minutes, I'm going to show you a way to cut through a lot of the confusion that currently exists. We have arguments about RCTs versus surveys, qualitative versus quantitative. Is process tracing the next new thing? Is contribution analysis still a great? And all this confusion and debate, I'm going to show you a way to bypass and rise above those debates. And we do this by including 3 specific pieces of evidence in our evaluations. And if you adopt this approach in your own impact evaluations, your work will be better than 90% of what's being published today. So I'm going to start off with some practical examples to illustrate some points. I'm going to talk about the philosophy and impact evaluation methods. There's actually a lot of overlap between philosophy and impact approaches. And I'm going to talk about the evidence requirements for impact evaluation. And that's where I'm going to give you 3 criteria. And then we're going to practice using those 3 criteria. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a summary. There's a question for you to work on yourselves, and we'll have time for questions as well. Okay. Let's make a start. This is real world data from the US. There's actually a strong correlation between people who die by falling out of wheelchairs with the cost of potato chips in the United States. This is true. And I thought about this for a while now, and I think here's what's happening. In supermarkets, they put high profit items at eye level, and essential things that are low profit, like bread or milk, that tend to be low or high on the shelves. So if you're in a wheelchair and you're reaching for a high profit margin item, you actually have to reach up high. And so what I think happens is you reach up high, you fall out of your wheelchair, you hit your head and you die. Now, if this sounds silly, well, it is, because I just made up that explanation. The correlation between deaths and the cost of potato chips is real, but my explanation, I just made that up. And the point I want to make is this, twofold. Anytime you see a trend, 2 variables that have a common trend, they will correlate, even if they have nothing to do with each other. Just by pure chance, they will always correlate. And secondly, you know how you look at clouds in the sky, and you can see animals, shapes, your former wife, whatever. The human mind is a master at detecting patterns and imposing meaning. We will create meaning even if none exists. And so that's what I just did with my explanation about the relationship between deaths and the cost of potato chips. I made that up. This is something that is all very too easy for evaluators to do as well. When they see some patterns of data, we can impose a meaning on it. And I'm going to suggest some ways we can avoid making these sort of false claims. How about this one? My daughter actually said this to me one day when she was about 12. She had a math exam that afternoon. And I said to her in the morning, Lisa, have you studied for your exam today? And she says, no, not really, but I'll study hard next week and then I'll get a good grade in my end of year exam. And I thought, well, hang on, you're going to study hard next week when your exam is this afternoon. Now, on the surface of it, that's quite absurd. But let's tease out what makes it absurd. It's absurd because we have a common understanding that something that happens today is the cause of something tomorrow. But something that happens today does not cause an event from yesterday. So causality has a forward moving relationship, and that's quite fundamental, and I'll come back to that. Here's another example. The young person's on the plane and they're complaining that every time the fasten your seatbelt sign comes on, the plane starts getting really rough and bouncing around. Of course, the young person is making the error that it's the red light coming on, the fasten your seatbelt sign coming on, that's causing the turbulence. Well, it's not. There's a third thing. The external turbulence leads the pilot to turn on the sign, and then the people inside the plane experience a bumpy ride. So the young person's misunderstanding what is causing what. So there's actually a third thing that's causing the pilot to turn on the light, and then they get the turbulence. Now, in the field of philosophy, so I'll put it this way. Impact evaluations are about causal relationships. Does this program cause this specific effect? And philosophy actually is the study of causal relationships. Within philosophy, there's a number of schools of thought of what causal relationships are, what they mean, how you study them. And what's not generally always widely known is that each of these schools of philosophy has a corresponding evaluation model. Yeah. So at one extreme, we have people who believe that the external world is governed by universal laws, like the law of gravity. And evaluators from this school of thought, Borich and the MIT Poverty Lab, they tend to prefer true experiments and quantitative methods. On the other hand, there's people like Guba and Lincoln, qualitative folks, who believe that the observable world is a social construct, and the concept of causality is a myth. They think there is no such thing. And so they prefer qualitative methods such as participant observation studies, and they portray people's experiences and perceptions. When it comes to undertaking impact evaluations, in my view, I find one evaluation model particularly helpful, and it's not very well known in Australia. It's called critical multiplism. And critical multiplism believes that there is an external world that is independent of ourselves, but we can never know that world perfectly. The best we can do is study it from multiple perspectives. So this then takes you down the path of multiple methods. In this approach, causal relationships are probabilistic, not deterministic. For example, if you smoke a packet of cigarettes for 30 years, your chances of getting cancer are about 20%. But not everyone who smokes for 20 years gets cancer. And also, some people who never smoke also get lung cancer. So the relationship between smoking a packet of cigarettes a day for 30 years, the causal relationship between that and lung cancer is probabilistic. If you do that behavior, you get a much higher rate of lung cancer, but it's not 100%. So in that sense, it's not a deterministic relationship, the way some people think causality works. And in the field of critical multiplism, the question of determining whether or not a program has had a particular effect is identical to establishing whether or not the program is the cause of a specified effect. So cause-effect questions ask if the program led to a specific change in the target group. For example, do training programs improve employment rates for long-term unemployed youth? Or do low-interest government loans lead to an increase in the number of self-sufficient small businesses? Applying this in practice is, in order to conclude that program X causes outcome Y, and I use the symbols X and Y, because if you read a textbook about this, that's the symbols that are generally used. So in order to conclude that program X has caused outcome Y, 3 criteria need to be met. And this is the heart of my argument. Before you can say this program has caused an effect, this specific effect, you first of all need to demonstrate an association between participating in the program and the outcome. So you might get a group of people who've participated in the program, another group of similar people who did not participate in the program, and assess the relationship between participation in the program and achievement of the outcome. That's the first evidentiary requirement. The second one is establishing time order. That is to say, participation in the program happens first, achievement of the outcome happens second. And the third is they need to rule out all alternative explanations. That is to say, all explanations aside from the program that might have caused the outcome. So this is the heart of my argument. The 3 examples I gave you earlier in the day, potato chips and death. That's the criteria 1. It's demonstrating a relationship. The example of my daughter and her studying for the exam after the exam was over is criteria number 2, establishing time order. And number 3, the young person on the airplane thinking the fasten your seatbelt sign causes a rough ride is an example of number 3, where it was the external turbulence. So I appreciate I'm asking you to think about impact evaluation and what causality means in a different way than what is normally used. And so that could be a bit challenging, and I accept that. And don't worry if you feel this is a little bit confusing just at the moment. We're going to work through some examples, and I think you might find this is actually a really helpful way of thinking. So, onto some practical explanations. Whenever you see a correlation between program participation and the achievement of some effect, some outcome, there's only 4 possible explanations. There's 4 and only 4. And the first one is the relationship is pure chance. It's methodological error. It means nothing. It's like my wheelchair and the cost of potato chips example. It just means nothing. There might be a correlation between the number of blue-winged butterflies in Ireland and the price of scotch in Sydney. It just means nothing. Anytime you get 2 long-term trends in the same direction, they'll correlate. They may or may not actually have anything to do with each other. It can just be pure chance. That's the first potential explanation. The second one, and this is the one that we're usually interested in, is program causes the effect, the outcome. And so we want to try and find out if that's what's driving things. A third potential explanation is that people higher on the effect outcome actually seek out the program. So in that sense, the causal relationship is reversed. This appears to be what happens with some microcredit programs where people with lower income, but not the lowest of the low income, go and seek out the program. It's also been some examples with adult reading programs where adults with underdeveloped reading skills, but not the worst of the worst, they go and seek out reading programs. And so it causes a false impression of what's actually going on in terms of effectiveness. And the fourth potential explanation, and this one is the hardest of them all, is there's something else that causes both program participation and the effect, the outcome. And so the correlation between the two is, as they say, spurious. These sort of alternative explanations are really, really common in social programs, and they're also very hard to sort out. A common example is where Z is motivation. So highly motivated people seek out the program, and because they're also highly motivated, they get good outcomes. It's not the program that makes the difference, it's their level of motivation. That's just a really common example. So don't worry if this still seems a little bit confusing yet. We got plenty of time. We're going to go through some examples now. So I'm arguing that to be credible and trustworthy, an impact evaluation must bring these 3 pieces of evidence to bear in making a conclusion: demonstrate association, establish time order, and rule out these alternative explanations. And there's technical terms for each of those 3 things, but I'm trying to avoid those. So let's practice. This is true. There's a positive correlation between iPhone sales and the number of deaths from falling downstairs. My wife has sort of warned me about this a few times because I'll be busy looking at my phone. I'm walking down the street. In fact, once I even tripped over a curb. But you know what? This is another one of those trend things. We have 2 common trends. We have one trend of iPhone sales increasing over time, and we have another trend of increasing number of deaths due to people falling downstairs, which is driven by population increases. One's not causing the other. They're just 2 things that are independent of each other that just happen to be occurring at the same time. How about this one? This one's kind of interesting. And this is also true. The more firemen that are sent to a fire, the more damage that is done. On the surface of it, you might think, oh, gee, don't send me too many firemen if my house is on fire. But in fact, this is a Z example. What's happening is if you have a really big fire, that's the Z, you then send lots of firemen, which is X, which leads to more damage to your house, which is the Y. So this other thing is driving both of them. How about this one? This is also true. There's a strong correlation between autism and organic food sales. You might be tempted to reach a quick conclusion and say, well, gee, don't feed organic food to your children. But as you might have guessed already, it's just two trends. They're independent of each other. There's no mechanism that links these two things together. It just happens to be chance. But it's very easy, notice, to overinterpret what this means. This is a common one. You see this one quite a lot in the literature, where there's a strong relationship between participating in job training and then getting a job 6-12 months later. I was at the European Evaluation Conference, 10 years ago, and someone did a big fancy statistical analysis on this. And then I said, well, yeah, but how have you controlled for motivation? Because surely the most highly motivated people will be the ones who seek out the job training and complete the training. And also the most highly motivated people are the ones who are most likely to get a job. So how have you controlled for that? And they were a bit annoyed with me because they didn't have a good answer to that. And it was a little bit embarrassing for all concerned. This is one of my favorite examples. You know, the Australian doctor, was it about 10 years ago? He established that stomach ulcers, most types of stomach ulcers are caused by a bacteria. And he drank the bacteria, gave himself a stomach ulcer, swallowed antibiotics, killed the ulcer and the bacteria, drank bacteria, got himself an ulcer again, took antibiotics, got rid of it again. He did several cycles of that. And he established quite clearly that these ulcers, at least the ulcers of that type, were caused by a bacteria. And yet here's the interesting part, for me anyway. There's been research done, and I have to get this right now, 80% of patients and 70% of doctors following surgery for ulcers will report that the surgery was helpful. And we know that that does not work. It absolutely does not work. Surgery for ulcers is a waste of time because it's caused by a bacteria. And yet 80% of patients, 70% of doctors will say the surgery was helpful when it did not work. We know it doesn't work. So I'm arguing that one needs to be a little bit careful in taking satisfaction and perception data as being equivalent to impact. These are actually different concepts in my view. This is another example. This is real world example. And this is my own work actually from a long time ago. I was working in juvenile justice. And I developed an intervention program for hardcore juvenile offenders in northern WA. And in the baseline year, there was 440 juvenile offenses. And we introduced the program. There were street workers, recreation activities. I was running a part-time school for these kids. I was organizing voluntary work for them. And then 2 years later, we'd moved from 440 offenses a year down to 350. I thought I was pretty good. And I admit I probably felt a little bit smug about this. So 440 offenses down to 350, 20% reduction. Is that a good basis for me to claim success, that my program worked? Did I deserve credit for that? It's actually not as simple as what it might seem at first. This is what was actually going on. So this gross change of 20% reduction, that gross observed change is actually made up of three things. There's the net program impact, the actual causal effect of this program that I developed, if there is one. There's also the effects of other events and processes, maturation, motivation, differential selection, other programs that are operating, and also methodological error. Perhaps the actual 440 down to 350 those numbers were a little bit, there was some error in those numbers. And so the name of the game, if you're going to use before and after comparisons, is to try to keep methodological error to a minimum, control for the effects of other events and processes, and then what you're left with, the final figure that you're left with, is your net program impact. So that then raises a question, well, how do you control for the effects of other events or processes? Well, as I was saying at the bottom of this slide, One way to do that is through randomization. That is the whole point of randomization, is to control for these other events. Another way is you can try and use control groups or comparison groups. Another thing you can do is try and identify and measure these other events and processes. And if you can do that, you can control for them statistically. If you can't measure them, at least you can identify them and try and argue why they are relevant or not relevant in a logical sense. Or, as we often see in international aid where I work, people will just ignore them. Oh, well, there's been an improvement over the last 10 years, therefore we deserve the credit. And you just pretend that these other events and processes and influences never existed in the first place. In fact, I read a major journal study yesterday on this that had that exact example. They said, the higher the volume of international aid provided to a country, the better the governance processes were, and the better the economic development, the faster the economic growth was. And then at the very last paragraph of their 30-page journal article, they said, of course, there are all of these other effects and events and processes that might be operating, but we didn't measure any of them, so who knows? I thought that was a bit of a fudge after having to read 30 pages to get to that. So I'm arguing that for policymaking, we want to know what works, for whom, in what circumstances, how, at what cost. And what I'm calling interactions are pretty much the norm. And by interactions, I mean the program works really well for males, but not females. Or the program works really well in rural areas, but not urban areas. Or for this group of people, not that group of people. You should expect that. It is almost universal that this happens. It is so incredibly common. It even happens biologically, actually. It's interesting. If you have high blood pressure in the United States, if you're of Caucasian European descent, you get one drug. If you're African American, you get a different drug because they work differentially for different groups of people. And it's the same with programs. It's very common. And I'm arguing that in order to conclude that program X causes outcome Y, 3 criteria must be satisfied. I've said association, time order, and rule out alternative explanations. For me, this is the absolute heart. So when you're planning your evaluation, I'm suggesting you be thinking about, how am I going to get information, evidence on association? How am I going to establish time order? What am I going to do to rule out alternative explanations? When you're planning your evaluation, think about these 3 things. Similarly, if you're contracting out your evaluation, in the evaluation plan from your contractor, you want to be seeing these 3 things clearly specified. Again, if you want to consider the merits of a particular evaluation approach in a given context, your contractor says, oh, well, we're going to do process tracing. You want to say, okay, what are the strengths and weaknesses of process tracing in our context in terms of getting those 3 pieces of evidence? What about contribution analysis or most significant change? How would they deal with those 3 things? Because to my argument is those 3 pieces of evidence, those, I'll call them evidentiary criteria, they're the main game. And to do this work, I'm offering you some tools. My first tool is this XYZ diagram. I would strongly suggest every single time you put your mind to this, does this program cause this effect, you draw an XYZ diagram and you start adding the arrows. And this book I've mentioned, Pearl and Mackenzie, the whole book is just about these diagrams, how you use them, what works, what doesn't work, and what do you do when you run into data problems. I would very strongly recommend this is always your starting point. A second tool I'm suggesting for you is to think about when you're working with observed changes from time 1 to time 2, that there's 3 bits of information in this. And you think about how you're going to identify and control for the effects of other events and processes. At the same time, you're minimizing methodological error so that what you're left with is the net program impact. My argument is, I don't have a particular loving or hating for any one particular method. They all have their places. Methodological decisions always have to be context dependent. And so arguments, in my view, arguments about experiments are awful, qualitative interviews are fantastic, or surveys for statistical adjustments are the answer. I don't like those sort of arguments because methodological decisions always have to be made within a context. And what works is going to depend upon the context, the data, the maturity of the program, all that sort of stuff. My argument would be what you want to do is to select the strongest possible research design that you can, and then add additional research designs, measures, and elements until you've adequately covered off the 3 evidentiary criteria. That, to me, is the name of the game. And this reference here is a real-world example where someone has done that. They had a basic comparison group, and they added one feature on top of another feature on top of another feature until on top of another feature, until they'd done quite a reasonable job of establishing association, temporal order, and ruling out these Zs, these alternative explanations. It's really worth a look, this particular reference. And just, it goes without saying, but just to reinforce it, conducting an impact evaluation assumes that there's fidelity of implementation and consistent intervention. That is to say, there's something stable that we're actually evaluating the impact of, and that this thing was implemented with integrity. I probably read 3 to 4 impact evaluations done by other people every week. And I think there's some common things that get confused. And I think it's important to distinguish between impact evaluation and theory building. These are quite different things. You can do an inductive theory building through evaluation. That's great. You've built a theory, but that's not the same as impact evaluation. Because for an impact evaluation, you need the 3 pieces of evidence that I've spoken about. Similarly, seeking evidence to support or confirm a theory, again, is not the same thing as impact evaluation. In particular, seeking to confirm a theory does not deal with the issue of rival explanations, the Zs. You're pretending that they're not there. Another common one is portraying the views and experiences of program staff and participants as if that is the impact. Unfortunately, well, it's not unfortunate, but there's a very large volume of evidence in the field of cognitive bias that makes it pretty clear that human beings are absolutely terrible at perceiving causal relationships. And I don't mean to say that the experiences of program participants and staff aren't important. They are, particularly for voluntary programs. But their perceptions are not the same thing as program impact. If you collect that information, great, share it as their perceptions, but don't try and then morph that into, oh, and that's the same thing as the impact. Another one is the opinion of experts. Martin Ravelon from the World Bank did some work on this in job programs. And there was a few different World Bank job programs, and he got experts independently of each other to rate the success, the impact of these programs without having actually any data, just seeing the programs themselves and their design and that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, experts are no better than laymen at perceiving program impacts. That is to say, his experts were basically guessing. They didn't know. And to be fair to them, they can't know. Unless you've done an impact evaluation, you're not going to know. There is no basis for you to know. So I'm arguing, let's be careful in our reports and not confuse theory building, confirming a theory, portraying people's views, getting expert opinion as the same thing as impact evaluation. They're not. The opinions of experts are the opinions of experts. That's not the same concept as program impact. And when you're planning your evaluation, there's some standard, quite common points of comparison you can use. You can have treatment versus control or comparison groups. You can compare intervention A versus intervention B versus intervention C. I think that's hugely underutilized, quite honestly. You can have dose response patterns, that is, people get no program whatsoever, people who get a little bit of it, people who get a bit more, people who get a lot, intensive bit of the program, and you can look at their outcomes and how they change. You can look at outcome trends or trajectories over time, how the outcome variable has changed before, during, after program participation, and that can often be quite insightful. You can also look at outcomes across different locations, across different groups and time periods. So those are just some common ones that are worth thinking about. I think it is now fair to say over the last 25 years, there's quite a bit of research been done. And I can say with some confidence, based on this research, we know now pretty well what the stronger non-experimental research designs for impact evaluation are. What are called regression discontinuity designs, where you have a decision criteria, like people below this score get the program, people above that score don't. Or people who score high on this thing get an award or a benefit, and people below that. We have one of these programs where eligibility is based on a cutoff score. They are very, very strong, and you can get very confident results from those sorts of studies. Same thing with an interrupted time series. We've got an ongoing time series, could be say 15, 20 time periods with there's a program introduced in the middle of that, and then you've also got a comparison group that doesn't get the program. Those are also very strong. What the research literature calls multiple baseline designs, or economists call pipeline designs, is when you have a series of phases to a program. In phase 1, the program goes to area A. In phase 2, the program goes to area B. Phase 3, the program goes to area 3, and so forth. Those sort of designs are also really important, because if you track the patterns in the outcomes, it can lead to some quite strong conclusions. Cohort designs are where you have a group, say, final year high school students, and you compare the outcomes from one year to the next, to the next, to the next, and there's a program introduced somewhere along that pathway. Alternating treatment, remove treatment designs. It's not something you see much outside of medicine, but with a single person, if they were in need of a particular medication, they could get it, their symptoms improve, you take away the medication, the symptoms got worse. These are very strong conclusions, because it helps you to establish time order association, and it does rule out alternative explanations, but not so relevant for social programs. And finally, comparative case studies or dose response models based upon a well-developed understanding of the program with pattern matching. These can be quite strong too, but I say be careful, because it requires a well-developed understanding of the program so that you know what alternative explanations you should be looking for and measuring, and that way you can compare patterns over time of the different outcome variables. Campbell in his book calls these not equivalent outcome designs. So in terms of general guiding principles, you need high quality outcome measures, match groups, if you can, program and comparison on pre-treatment outcomes. So control for self-selection, that is differences in motivation and incentives across the groups. You want to measure outcomes several times, both before, during, and after program participation, or at least 4 times if you possibly can in total. Before program, the middle of the program, short term after the program, longer term after the program, to get a sense of trends, because that can really help you understand what's going on. And to allow for interactions. That is to say, some groups of participants do well, others not so well in the program. I'm coming up to the end of the points I want to make. I'm arguing that method-led approaches to impact evaluation are not the way to go. We all know people who say, right, no matter what the question is, the context, I'm doing a case study, or I'm doing some econometric analysis, or no, I only want to know about experiments, that's it. Recently, I've come across a few process tracing advocates who think that's the only approach. I do not believe in method-based approaches for the reasons I've outlined. Methodological decisions need to be context dependent in relation to the program. And the question is not the method. The question is how you get those three relevant pieces of evidence. Similarly, I'm not an advocate for program theory-led. There's a few reasons for that. And Cook in his 2000 paper, what do you call it? The false choice between experiments and program theory evaluations. Program theories can help you decide what to measure, but unfortunately, it's not the same thing as impact evaluation. What John Main was doing in contribution analysis was basically, he wanted to use he wanted to use performance indicators to make impact evaluation conclusions. And so what he did was he'd say, okay, well, you have a theory of change, you measure the different levels of your theory of change, and then you reach an impact conclusion. Unfortunately, it took the field of evaluation nearly 10 years to realize that that wasn't enough on its own. And so after about 10 years, Main himself started writing about, well, you also need to rule out alternative explanations for any changes. But he didn't actually offer any views on how you did that. And he never came to grips with the idea of temporal order. That is to say, the program happens first, outcome has to happen second. So Lemire in the European Journal of Evaluation wrote an article about contribution analysis 2 years ago, saying it was a useful adjunct, but on its own, it wasn't quite enough to reach credible impact evaluation conclusions. And I know some people might not like what I've just said, but my point is not to be driven by particular methods, but to be driven by our evidentiary criteria: association, temporal order, and ruling out alternative explanations. That to me is the main game. I don't mind if you do case studies, econometrics, or whatever else. I just want you to make sure that you've got those three evidentiary parts covered off. I'll stop there. I've got a question for us to discuss, but before I do, I'd like to invite John to let me know if there's any questions in the chats or if people want to ask any questions before we move on to the next little bit.
Hi, Scott, it's Mark here. John has posed, John Pillar has posed a really good question, as has Ian. So we've got two questions for you.
Okay, let's fire away.
I'll read it, and if John wants to come in online and augment, by all means, and the same will apply for Ian. So John's question or comment is, if the universal effectiveness of an intervention is proven and it is to be implemented for the first time in a new environment, is program fidelity sufficient to assume that it will also work, e.g. flu vaccinations? No need to re-demonstrate effectiveness, just need to ensure program fidelity. John suspects there still might be risks. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I'm with John. I was reading a really interesting article 2 or 3 days ago from Howard White from the Campbell collection on this very issue. And he would say, well, we've established that the program works in this context. Let's treat that as a hypothesis as to perhaps it might work in this other context that we're familiar with, but we can't take it as a given. So we better treat that as something we need to test and examine, rather than just say, because it worked in place A, it's going to automatically work in place B. Maybe the contextual environment is different in the second place, or maybe the implementation will be different in some important ways in the second locations. So yeah, I think it's a working hypothesis rather than a given.
Does that mean we need to collect the same information all over again?
Well, I would be interested in the second place. What is the extent of the need? How do we know how much need there is? Are we trying to service 1,000 people, 10,000, 100,000 people? In terms of the service delivery mechanism, there could be cultural considerations. If you're trying to deliver vaccines to rural parts of PNG highlands, refrigeration is going to be a problem. How are you going to manage that? Yeah. So not necessarily the similar, but you need to be conscious of what the risks are. So I wouldn't take it as an automatic.
Is there something
given.
else I can help with?
Okay. Thanks, Scott. So Ian has a question. Providing those funding for new programs, perhaps those providing funding for new programs should apply the principles outlined today before they allocate funds. This action may improve the post-program evaluation process, particularly in relation to assigning meaningful timeframes and appropriate funding to assist the production of meaningful outcomes. What incentives or forms of motivation would you apply to the politicians and funding sources to do more than just throw money at the project, rather than taking a more responsible approach to the end-to-end evaluation process? Have you any examples where the evaluation process has been clearly defined at the time of the program funding?
Oh, wow. You got some great issues in that, Ian. I love it. Just for context, here in Australia, we've recently had the government announce we're going to have an Australian Centre for Evaluation. And the purpose of this Australian Centre for Evaluation is to build capacity in the Commonwealth Federal Australian government departments to conduct and use evaluations, and also to do some randomized control trials to produce high quality evidence about what works. And I think they've got 10 million over the next 4 years. Around the world, we've seen a number of different initiatives to drive evaluation. For example, in Australia from 1986 to 1996, we had the Financial Management Improvement Program that made it compulsory to do evaluations on a 3 to 5 year cycles. And that worked pretty good in the initial years. And then the Department of Finance used the results of those evaluations to adjust budgets. So programs that were performing well could keep money. Programs that were performing not so well either lost money or had to be redesigned somehow. It took about 3 years for government agencies to understand what was going on. And then after that, every evaluation said, my program's fantastic, because they were trying to protect their budget. This has been a dilemma for how to get the political system to value evidentiary information in the decision-making process. Every Western country and some others are struggling with this. The World Bank has, 45 years of experience in evaluation capacity building now around the world. And there's probably, I'd say there's 3-4 areas you can focus on. One is leadership's demand for an ability to make use of performance feedback. The second is the supply of performance feedback evaluation work. And this is all underpinned by what I'll call the institutional infrastructure, your policies, your systems, your resources, and so forth. What every country has done, just about every country around the world who's got into evaluation capacity building has done the same thing. They train staff, they form a community practice, and they produce more evaluation reports. That's just about what every country has done. And it has failed consistently around the world for the last 30 years. And yet we keep doing the same thing. Countries that have made good progress, Chile 15 years ago, Malaysia 10 years ago, South Africa right now as we speak, they all have one thing in common, and that is senior level commitment to the evaluation process. So government and MPs are demanding evaluation, and they are using it for their own purposes. That is a consistent finding around the world. And I'd go further. It would seem Chile's really quite interesting, because what they did was high profile impact evaluations that had major policy consequences or potential budgetary consequences were controlled by the Prime Minister's office. They did it. They often used academics or consulting firms, but they wrote the terms of reference, they oversaw it, they funded it, they did it. And then they would let departments do implementation type studies. That sort of distinction, I think, is quite good because it helps to align the incentives. It continues to surprise me that we can have major departments. I've worked in several of them as a consultant, so I'm not going to name them all, but they don't have an evaluation plan. They know their staff capacities are limited. Their systems aren't necessarily set up for this. So there's things that can be done. For example, all new policy proposals that go to cabinet could have an evaluation requirement in them. saying, yes, here's our new policy proposal. We need this much money for the program. Here's how much we're going to set aside for the evaluation. And we're going to do our first evaluation here and a second one there. That could be part of it. Why aren't secretaries held to account for major programs? I can think of a couple that are worth more than $100 million, been operating over 20 years and have never been evaluated. How is it that secretaries aren't held to account for that sort of behavior? So yeah, there's a combination of incentives and capacity gaps that I'm talking about in general. And we have a lot of international lessons. But it's that marrying of the political agendas and the more technocratic, bureaucratic agendas and how you get them to speak to each other. That's fascinating. I know I've rambled a little bit, but it's an interesting topic.
Thanks, Scott. No, I liked what you were saying there, particularly about how do we get the senior leadership to take some responsibility. It's always been a problem. We've got two other questions. One is, could you please repeat the author you just mentioned who said to treat a working program in one context as a hypothesis in another?
Oh, Howard White, W-H-I-T-E. He used to be the head of the 3IE, the International Impact Evaluation. They do all sorts of impact evaluations around the world. And then they say, right, here's what works in WASH. Right, here's what works in education. He's now head of the Campbell collaboration. And so he publishes blogs and websites. He writes some really good stuff, often from an econometric perspective, but his commitment to evidence and using that to inform decision-making is beyond question in my view.
Okay, thank you. That's useful. Emma Freeman has asked, what can you do if it's very difficult to rule out alternative explanations, e.g. a very complex environment where there might be many factors involved? And I was going to ask something similar, but it was more about the motivation side of things. How do you know or rule out if it's motivation causing a result? Because without a program, the outcome perhaps wouldn't have been achieved. Even if people are highly motivated. So over to you, Scott.
Yeah, I'll answer in a couple of different ways. Ed, I think that I'm not trying to be an advocate for experiments because I just don't want to be in that position and it's not my belief. But having said that, I think in the early days, we don't make nearly enough use in Australia of pilot projects, pilot programs, and we test things. We don't do that nearly as much as what we could do. And one example is there's a research design called the factorial experiment, where you can have multiple different combinations of the main intervention plus various combinations of supplementary bits. If you could implement one of those and test it, it would give you a nice sense of what combination of factors works and what doesn't. And if you have the money and you can do that in 2 or 3 different types of locations, like a major urban, a rural, a remote area, that'll give you some sense of what works. But it doesn't let you off the hook of still having to fine tune things in the local context. But it gives you a start. My diagram on what I called gross observed change was about that issue of, oh, okay, well, maybe there's a program effect, but then there's the influence of other things. And I gave you a list of what to do about the other things. One way is randomization, but that's not always possible or feasible or desirable. Another way is to identify them and measure them. And then you can control them and eliminate their effect by doing that. Job training program for young people. Before going into the program, if you had a measure of their motivation and their academic background and skills, you could then figure that into the equation along with, well, here's the effect of the program, here's the effect for motivation, here's the effect for education and skills on job outcomes. So randomization, measure things. If you identify and measure them, you can control for them. The other way is to try and use logical argument. Campbell, in his different books, argues about this. He would say, well, if the effect was not the program, but motivation, we would expect to see the following pattern of consequences on different variables. And he invites people to articulate what that pattern of effects would look like if it wasn't the program, but it was a motivation effect, and then go and look for that to see if that's what happens. It's a little bit like what process tracing people try and do when they look for a series of logical relationships. This affects this, but affects that. So
Okay.
but it's a heck of a difficult issue. There is no doubt these alternative rival explanations are by far and away the most difficult thing to get a handle on. And then there's the logical argument approach, where you say, well, for these logical reasons, I don't think motivation is a factor here. Oh, well, why would you say that? Well, we have a mixture of highly motivated and lowly motivated students in our program, or whatever the argument might be. And then the last one, which really annoys me, is when researchers, evaluators just ignore these alternative explanations, pretend they don't exist. I think that's doing a disservice to everyone. At least acknowledge them in your report, that they're a potential, even if you couldn't adequately deal with them. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Scott. No, that's a fair comment and good response, so appreciated. We haven't had any more questions. We did get a thumbs up from Emma on that, so that looks good. You had a question that you wanted to pose to us.
Yeah.
Over to you, Scott.
All right. Maybe I think we've got a moment. I might say something just very briefly about experiments and ethics, because people often wonder about that. People will say randomization's unethical, improper. I don't share that view, and I've just wanted to explain why. If we knew a program worked, I would agree that it was unethical, improper to deny people access to that program. But most of the time, we don't know whether a program works or not, in which case to me, it's quite reasonable to have an experimental group that gets the program and another group of people who don't. And imagine this. What if the program is neutral or actually hurts people? And that happens. Surgery for ulcers is an example. So in that case, not getting the program isn't unethical. It's actually an advantage. I can give you another example too. Imagine that you have 10,000 people who really need a program, but you only have enough resources to service 1,000 of them. In that case, randomly allocating who takes up the program is actually probably the most appropriate thing to do of all. So when people say experiments are unethical, that argument assumes that the program works, which may or may not be true. And if we believe the program works, well, then we don't need to do an experiment anyway, because we already know. So I find that argument, people who use that argument haven't quite thought it through completely, but it's complex. Here's a discussion question I was going to invite people to wrestle with. And this is true. In 2006, the World Bank found that better monitoring and evaluation is associated with improved outcomes of their development projects. And so my question is, does this mean that M&E is an effective way to improve development results? I wanted to invite people to wrestle with this issue. And my approach, as always, is to ask you to think in terms of X, Y, and Z. In this case, the intervention is M&E. M&E is your X. And improved development results is Y. So I've used words, but what I've said is there's a relationship between M&E and improved development results. Does that mean one has caused the other?
How do you want us to contemplate that question, Scott? Do you want us to break out in groups, or just people to turn their microphones on and offer up a comment?
Well, maybe we should give people 2 or 3 minutes just to mull it over, and then we could have a group chat.
That would be good. And while people are mulling it over, I noticed John Pillar has also posted a comment suggesting that what you've said is what prosecutors might be doing. They have only, particularly when they only have a circumstantial case, they need to prove association, get the time order, and rule out alternative explanations, and have a logical and proven sequence of events that leads to the conclusion that the butler did it. So
that's an interesting observation, because Michael Scriven runs this argument that evaluation is like detective work. I don't agree with them. He'll use the example that somebody's dead and another person is holding a smoking gun. And we can use that sequence of events to reasonably conclude that the person holding the smoking gun shot the bullet that killed the dead person. My problem with that is that's not how evaluations work. An evaluation, so he starts his argument with a known effect, a dead person, and a potential cause, a person holding a smoking gun. Our work as evaluators is exactly the opposite. We start with a known program and an unknown effect. And Scriven's argument is exactly the opposite, a known outcome and a possible effect. So I actually don't like his argument on that one. But anyway, lots of people disagree with me on that.
I can see the logic. No, fair enough.
Shall we give, Mark, shall we give people, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes to mull over this issue, and then we'll come back and kick it around?
Please do. So, Fex, you got a question? And then Emma.
It was a comment. Hi, I'm Catherine Pontifex. I'm here on Ghanaland this evening. I guess the Z that immediately came to my mind was that an organisation with sophisticated M&E arrangements may broadly be a more capable organisation, more sophisticated organisation, and therefore implementation may also be effective as a consequence of that organisational capacity and capability. That's the Z. I just wanted to say I work in an epidemiology branch, and they use directed acyclic graphs. I had to look it up, but we all call them DAGs, which I find a really useful way, just as you've done with your X, Y, and Z, to contemplate all the possible Zs and whether they really are, rather than throwing into a statistical mix to eliminate confounders, throw in everything into the kitchen sink, really being intentional about what you think the possible confounders might be. So anyone wants to do reading, type in epidemiology DAG, and they're quite a good tool.
Yes, the book reference I gave you from Pearl, that's the source. That's where DAGs come from. He's the guy who originated this type of thinking. And I agree. I really like what you said about being purposeful in identifying what these Zs, these alternative explanations might be, and then trying to nail down the evidence. Well, if this is alternative explanation is the one that's really driving it, I would expect to see this consequence. But if it's not, it's something different, I'd expect a different pattern of results. So I really like how you put that. Thank you.
Okay, Emma?
I had the same thought as Catherine, which was that there was likely a shared cause of the two. The only other thing I had to add is that I guess the time order of these things might suggest that better monitoring and evaluation doesn't cause improved outcomes.
And that's sort of the mental process I'm always applying. Every time I have one of these situations, I literally get a piece of paper and I draw X, Y, and Z, and I start saying, well, which one's X, which one's Y? In this case, I'm saying M&E is associated with improved outcomes. So M&E is your X, improved outcomes is your Y. What does that mean for time order? Is it necessarily one occurs in time before the other? Oh, do you get better outcomes? You get better budgets, and then you get more to spend on your M&E? Does it work that way? Or does good M&E happen first? We don't know because I didn't tell you. And I didn't tell you on purpose, just to make it, have to think through it. Or maybe there's something else that drives them both. So thank you for your comment. That's really good, structured sort of approach. There's other views or comments people want to make?
I haven't seen anyone. Please feel free to take your microphone off and make a comment or ask a question. I certainly wonder whether evaluation results in the collection of better data, particularly if it's planned and funded, and therefore you can actually see your outcome. But
yeah, used to drive me nuts when I worked in DFAT, the number of development projects that we never collected baseline data on. And so we'd be 5 years into a project and they'd hire a firm to do an implementation outcome study. And I go, yeah, but we really don't know what the change is. My analogy is, well, I've been on a diet for 5 years, but I've never weighed myself until 5 years in. It's kind of hard to know if I'm improving or not.
Yep, agree. Oh, we have a hand. Yes, Melinda, please ask your question.
So I'm feeling like this might not be correctly philosophically pitched, but we've talked we've talked before in research about the Hawthorne effect, you know, where by virtue of participating, by virtue of asking particular questions or engaging with the subjects or providers of a particular program, the fact of the questions themselves or the fact of creating reflection can sometimes change the trajectory of outcome. So when I look at this question, I think what comes to mind for me is a lot of people really emphasize that notion of the MEL cycle. You're not just doing, I mean, if you talk about impact, as you're saying, right at the very end, then yes, there are challenges with talking about correlation. But if activities of the M&E are occurring through the course of a program and people are getting feedback, I would hope that there are improvements in what's going on as people reflect on what they're doing. So, but I don't know if that's kind of missing the point philosophically.
No, you're in the right neighborhood. I too hope that better M&E leads to better outcomes because people are getting feedback and using it. But how do I know it's caused it, or maybe something else has caused the better outcome? I'll tell you the answer. In the World Bank, they have these big databases and they rate their projects every year until they finish, and they track outcomes and effectiveness. So they had a database, I think it was 5,000 projects. And what they found was, yes, there was a strong relationship between the quality of M&E and improved development results all around the world. But the thing was, there was a Z, and the Z was the skills of and experience of the team leader leading the project. So highly skilled team leaders had better M&E and they had better development outcomes. There was a small effect just from M&E on its own, but most of it was driven by the Z, the team leader skills. And
so is that about then, do you reframe the variables that are related to cause? Do you know what I mean? Like it's yes. You're suggesting that Z's influencing both those things, but yes. Then is there another way of framing it if you were to move forward in the future and to say that people with strong management and evaluative skills are going to see better outcomes in their programs in the first place, or something along those lines? Yeah. And that the M&E is a variable, is an actual component in that success.
Yeah. If you wanted to run an argument, the key to success is highly skilled team leaders, and highly skilled team leaders have A, B, C, and D skills, including good at M&E, and that's where you get good development. I'd accept that argument.
Does that mean you could consider, if you were thinking in a clinical way, that M&E is potentially like a placebo effect? Do we need to run a trial where M&E is conducted, but there is no program that should work to see whether we do get a positive outcome?
Oh yeah, I see your argument. There was a small independent effect of M&E leading to better outcomes that was independent of the team leader. But it's interesting because it was the team leader who put the M&E, would make sure M&E was in place, and also the team leader who would make sure the results of M&E feedback was also used. So in that sense, the team leader was central to the whole thing, but there was a small separate effect that was independent of the team leader. It was only small.
Okay. Any other questions?
It's Ian here. I can't show you my picture because I'm in a state of undress, but be that as it may.
Thanks, Ian.
Too much information. My question, first of all, Scott, absolutely brilliant. Never spent a better hour on a webinar in my life. Really fantastic stuff. Oh. My question to you, though, is going to be along the lines of everybody listening to this or participating in this webinar all do things differently. And if we talk about good M&E team leaders, I would have thought that we'd have a high number of motivated people teaching and training everybody to be the same, but as we all know, they're not. So therefore, the biases of these team leaders come into play as well. So in your Z factor, I'm taking into consideration who was available at the right price to do the particular study. And that sounds cynical, but I have an accounting background, so I tend to be cynical.
No, I take
So,
your point. Yeah.
In which case, how do you determine what a good M&E leader is? And is that your bias coming into play?
Yeah.
With tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's a fair comment. I haven't given you all the background just to save time, but in the World Bank, just like DFAT actually, and the Asian Development Bank, they all do annual ratings of all their investment projects, and they rate a whole series of things. The relevance, the efficiency, the effectiveness, sustainability, indeed, the monitoring and evaluation. And so this research team with the, 5,000 projects to look at, had all that data to work with. And then they themselves went and developed a measure for the skills and experience of team leaders, and then brought that into the equation. So in that sense, there was pre-existing 5 years on the projects, but the data on the team leaders' skills and experience was brought in after the fact. So yeah, there are some potential biases in there, but I just use it. Sorry.
Would the countries that these programs have been performed in also have an impact on the way the team leaders are, because the team leaders would be working with the particular countries who've received the money?
That was the most fascinating part. The impact of the team leader was far and above the impact of what country was involved. So whether it was China versus Pakistan versus Palau was actually much less important than the team leader's skills. And I wouldn't have guessed that. That to me, that was the huge insight for me. That the skills of the team leader is what was the overwhelmingly important factor that drove good outcomes. And I didn't expect that.
Thank you.
So if the skills were the key impact of the team leader, were there one or two particular skills that were identified as being essential?
Yeah, I think they were, but to be honest, I can't quite remember what they were. But yeah, no, you're right though. They did talk about that. Sorry, I just can't remember the answer though.
That's all right, no problems. Any other questions or comments? And thank you, Ian, for your last question.
Well, can I say, I'm going to offer to share a copy of my PowerPoint with people. I also have a bibliography of references on impact evaluation and a little thinking piece about things to keep in mind when you're planning an impact evaluation. So I'm going to offer to send these as PDFs to Mark, and maybe you can liaise with the AES, and I'm happy for them to be shared with everyone who registered.
That's a very kind offer, and that is appreciated. I'll make sure that that happens. So thank you, Scott. If there are no more questions or comments, I'll just double check the chat. I've got a, no, all good. You're getting some thank yous in there. I'd like to thank you for the wonderful presentation, Scott, and the thought-provoking questions. And I know it's difficult for you to see rounds of applauses, but if people can a thumbs up or put a thanks in the comments, that'd be great. Or a clapping hand, some people are doing. Your time today and also spent preparing for this is greatly appreciated. I think we've all learned something. You've made us think, and that's what we've come here to do. So many, many thanks. And I'll make sure that we disseminate the information that you kindly share with us. And to those of you who posted questions or come online to speak, thanks for your participation, because that helps make the event really worthwhile and engaging.